Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. We are going to do the first half of the second part of the Battle of Midway today. Hiryu's Counterstrike. Hiryu's, sorry. Um, yeah, it's not a super long video, but I'm going to go ahead and cut it up into two, mostly because I have a lot to do today. I'm hoping to get the second part out the day after tomorrow. I have a specific video that I'm working on for tomorrow. I guess if I could get both of them out, I'll put both of them out tomorrow. But if I can't, the latest the second part should be out is day after tomorrow. So we're going to do the first half today. Let's go ahead and get into it.
Inside Hiryu's ready room was Lieutenant Tomonaga Joichi. He was the airstrike leader that had just battered Midway. He and his fellow airmen were resting when suddenly a pilot walked in and shouted, "The Akagi's damaged! The Soryu and Kaga are burning! We're the only ship that hasn't been hit!" Tomonaga and the men made their way to the decks to see what was going on. And one can only imagine the shock and horror on the pilots' faces as they saw their fellow sister ships burning fiercely on the horizon. Revenge had to be taken. Some sort of retribution had to be delivered. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi now found himself in command of the only operational carrier left in the Kido Butai. Despite the tragedy that had just befallen them, and the grim odds stacked against them, only one viable option remained in the eyes of the Japanese: to strike back. This is the Battle of Midway Part 2.
Yeah, but what do you... I know that from the Japanese perspective, the move here is obviously a counterstrike. But being pragmatic about it, is the move to send a counterstrike and then you're keeping yourself at least somewhat in distance for another attack? So you could literally lose, all four of your carriers here very easily. Like, that's a very realistic option. Or is the most prudent move to, say we've taken too much of a loss and just turn around and go back? What's your decision there if it's you? Obviously, taking out the kind of Japanese ethos from it, just from a strictly realism perspective.
Hiryu's counterstrike. Yamaguchi wasted no time sending the retaliatory strike. Led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, the strike consisted of a complete squadron of 18 dive bombers with 6 fighters as escorts. They took off at 10:54. Much was expected from this group as they were all piloted by seasoned veterans and considered by many to be an elite unit. Lifting the fog of war, we can now see that the Americans had 3 carriers with them, operating in 2 separate task forces. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher was in overall command. He was a cautious yet prudent commander who had a wealth of combat experience. He had previously fought the Japanese a month earlier at Coral Sea. Task Force 17 was under Fletcher's direct command, and it was centered on his flagship, the USS Yorktown.
Which, like I said, it was a damn miracle that the Yorktown is here at this battle at all.
Sole survivor of Coral Sea, the damaged Yorktown had been quickly patched up and made battle-worthy in just 2 days so that she could participate in the battle. It had been her dive bombers that had shattered the Soryu. Fletcher also had operational command of Task Force 16, which was led by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Task Force 16 contained the Hornet and the Enterprise, and it had been Enterprise's dive bombers that had taken out the Kaga and the Akagi. Currently, all 3 carriers were waiting anxiously for the return of their strike groups, and unfortunately for the Yorktown, she would be receiving some unwanted visitors as well. Kobayashi was heading her way.
They are going to do incredibly at keeping the Yorktown afloat. The crew on the Yorktown is really does not get enough credit for how incredibly well it performs on this day.
Contrary to belief, Nagumo was not a broken man after the disaster at 10:30. His reaction was quite defiant. After shifting his flag from the Akagi to the light cruiser Nagara, he ordered the Kido Butai towards the enemy, who were now believed to be only 90 miles away. He optimistically believed he could engage the Americans in a daylight surface action. However, this fanciful notion was shattered when at 12:40, reports showed the American forces were heading east and opening the distance. He subsequently changed course as well and began to head northeast. At 10:50, Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet and chief architect of the whole operation, was notified of the current situation of Nagumo's mobile force. One can envision his sorrow and dismay upon hearing the news that 3 of his carriers were on fire. Just like Nagumo, he too was hopeful that a surface engagement could be forced upon the Americans. At 12:20, he issued a series of orders to retrieve the situation. He ordered a concentration of his main warships to come to Nagumo's aid. In terms of air support, Yamamoto ordered the carriers Junyo and Ryujo, operating in the Aleutian campaign, to head south to join the Hiryu. There was just a problem though. All friendly forces were hundreds of miles away. Both Yamamoto with his main body of battleships and Admiral Kondo with his 2 fast battleships could arrive no sooner than the following morning. And the 2 carriers? Forget about it. They were over 2 days away. But ultimately, this effort didn't really matter because the Americans had no intention whatsoever of participating in a surface battle.
No, why would they? They just took out 3 Japanese carriers. Like, they did their job, right? They did their job. They did what they wanted to do. Why on earth would they want to get into a surface battle? That just, yeah, they would have no interest in that whatsoever.
We're heading east, away from the Japanese. So it was up to the Hiryu, with her meager air power alone, to take on the enemy. En route to the reported location, the Japanese air group encountered a group of stragglers returning to their carriers. The 6 Zeros apparently couldn't resist such a tempting target and, eager for revenge, broke ranks to attack them. This turned out to be a foolish move. The aircraft were SBD Dauntless dive bombers, who now without their bombs proved to be very agile and maneuverable. A sharp clash ensued, and although no planes were lost on either side, 2 Zeros were severely damaged that they had to return to their carriers.
Yeah, and I had a conversation in the comments yesterday about going back and forth about not just the Zeros, but some other aircraft at the time. And one of the things that wasn't mentioned in the video yesterday is essentially how the Zeros have glass jaws, right? They are kind of OP at the beginning of the war. There really isn't much that can be done to contend with them. And their kill ratio up until this point of the war is absurd, like double digits. However, they don't have very much defense. So as fast and maneuverable and long range as they are, the big weakness here is they don't have much defense. They have a glass jaw. So very easy for them to take damage. And as the war progresses and other fighters kind of catch up to them, it's hard to say because the Japanese lose a lot of really good pilots. So it's hard to say if the Allied doctrine is what made the biggest difference or if the loss of the best Japanese pilots is what made the most difference. But from this point on in the war, the Allies do much better at contending with the Zeros, as essentially had been done by anybody earlier and up to this point in the war.
The Val dive bombers now had only 4 escorting fighters and they were miles behind. This unnecessary skirmish would prove to be a fatal mistake. At 11:52, radar detected the Japanese strike 32 miles out. Yorktown had 8 fighters in the air, and the majority went in to intercept the strike formation. With their fighter escorts still too far behind to intervene, the attack proved devastating for the vulnerable dive bombers. The dive bombing formation was completely shattered and disorganized. 7 valves were shot out of the sky before the Zeros finally made an appearance, but even then, they only managed to shoot down 1 Wildcat before losing 3 of their own. During this engagement, 2 additional valves were destroyed and another 2 had to jettison their bombs, which meant it was now up to only 7 dive bombers to eliminate a carrier. The bombers decided to split into 2 divisions to attack the Yorktown. The first would attack directly from the west, while the other 4 would attack from the southwest, so that they could approach with the sun to their backs. Kobayashi's unit was reputed to be the best dive bombing squadron in the fleet, and they would soon confirm their elite status. The attack began at 12:10. The first plane was shot down, but his aim was true, striking the Yorktown abaft the number 2 elevator. The second got a near miss, starting a minor fire on the fantail. The third and fourth missed their mark as the Yorktown was turning to port to throw off their aim. But the 5th bomber landed the most damaging blow. It exploded deep inside her hull, damaging the stack uptakes and snuffing out all but one of her boilers. Thick smoke began to gush out and Yorktown's speed dropped. Then, another heavy hit was scored, knocking out her forward elevator and starting several fires deep in her hull. The attack concluded with the final plane scoring a near miss. 4 minutes after the attack, the Yorktown came to a halt and was dead in the water, with heavy fires on board. The carrier was out of operation. This picture shows the dive bombing attack in the initial stages. Notice the damaged dive bomber about to crash into the water. Its tail has been completely shot off. The dives conducted by Kobayashi's unit were nearly vertical and were held steady despite the intense anti-aircraft fire the Americans had put up. Hitting a moving target cruising at 30 knots was no small feat, and the result speaks for itself. 3 hits and 2 damaged near misses from 7 aircraft? It had been a spectacular performance, one that even the Americans begrudgingly acknowledged.
Yeah, that's kind of incredible.
Kobayashi was not amongst the survivors, but he would have been proud of his unit for this impressive achievement. However, the attack had suffered intolerable losses. Only 5 of the 18 valves made it back. That's a 72% loss rate. And of the remaining escorts, only 1 of the 4 Zeros made it home. If the Japanese continued like this, they wouldn't have any more attack aircraft left by the evening. In return for all this damage, the Americans had lost only 1 Wildcat. The survivors enthusiastically reported to Yamaguchi that they had left a carrier dead in the water and burning fiercely. By this point, the Japanese knew they were facing 3 carriers, and according to their scorecard, if 1 had been taken out, it meant that it was now 1 versus 2.
Yeah, but again, like I said, the crew of the Yorktown does so well at essentially, minimizing damage that it's not really 3-on-2. At least not. It's not gonna look. It's not gonna look like. Not 3-on-2. It's not 2-on-1. It's going to look as if the Yorktown is, fine. That's what it's going to seem like.
The battle could still be won, although a considerable amount of luck would be needed. The second strike prepared for their launch. Unfortunately for Yamaguchi, Hiryu's carrier attack unit had been the one that had suffered the most losses on the Midway strike. So instead of the regular complement of 18 torpedo planes, only 10 Kates were available for the attack. The strike was to be led by Lieutenant Tomonaga. Earlier, his plane had suffered a hit, and although it had been patched up, it kept leaking fuel, meaning he might not have enough fuel to return. Other pilots pleaded to switch planes with him, but Tomonaga refused. With a touch of humor, he told them that the Yankees were only 90 miles away, and that he could make it there and back on a single tank of gas. At 1331, the strike took off along with its escort of 6 fighters. Before their departure, Yamaguchi had reminded his pilots, "There's 2 undamaged carriers left. Your mission is to take out one of them." It was imperative that this strike destroy at least one of the 2 undamaged carriers. This would then even the odds and make it 1 versus 1. And with that result, the prospect of a Japanese victory wouldn't be so far-fetched.
But what if the out of operation and damaged carrier doesn't look like it? What if it's, what if it looks like an undamaged carrier? Especially from, how high you are up in the sky.
En route to the target location, the air group sighted a carrier task force 30 miles away at 1430. The carrier was not on fire, nor showed any indication that it was damaged. So clearly, this had to be one of the undamaged ones. Accordingly, Tomonaga settled on attacking this untouched force. However, unbeknownst to the Japanese, this was not a new carrier. It was the Yorktown again. American damage control had been superb, and following the dive bombing attack, the Yorktown's crew had been able to put out the fires and had restored enough of her boilers to bring her up to 19 knots. Thus, Hiryu's second attack was about to be spent on an injured carrier. Tomonaga approached from the carrier's port quarter. He decided on executing a standard split attack. Radar had detected the incoming strike 45 miles out, but only 6 fighters were available. All 6 were sent to intercept, but only 2 found the enemy, shooting down a single torpedo bomber. By this point, the Yorktown had begun an evasive turn to starboard, giving Tomonaga a poor attack angle. In response, he divided his small force once again to conduct yet another anvil attack. The 4 planes were about to pass the outer ring of escorts when this picture was taken from the USS Pensacola. Note the heavy anti-aircraft fire that Tomonaga and his pilots had to fight through. The Americans would have to throw everything they could at this attack to save their carrier. Fortunately, they had one of their own best pilots on scene, Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch. Having just taken off from the Yorktown, he was determined to repel this assault. Coming in at 200 feet and flying at 200 knots, Lieutenant Tomonaga steadied his aircraft to make his torpedo run.
This is a very interesting, back and forth chess match here, where you have not just the planes, the bombers and then the fighters, and whether you have escorts or don't have escorts, but then you, on this specific run, you have this plan figured out, the force splits of the incoming bombers. The Yorktown sees it, turns, and then the Japanese bombers then break off again in order to kind of recalibrate to the turn of the carrier. So it's this very interesting kind of back and forth between the two. Not, because you kind of think you go on a run, if you're in a bomber, you see a ship or a carrier or whatever, and then you obviously see it, you go down, you start your run. It's obviously more complicated than that. And it's interesting to see kind of how they have this back and forth of trying to get the best hits and trying to do everything they can to protect the carrier on the other side.
To his right, a Wildcat came roaring towards him. It was none other than Jimmy Thatch, and he delivered a devastating pass at Tomonaga's plane. The aircraft was badly damaged and set on fire. Nevertheless, with nerves of steel, Tomonaga pushed on and with impressive skills, still managed to launch his torpedo. His plane crashed shortly afterwards, killing him and his crew. Unfortunately for Tomonaga, his torpedo did not hit. His wingman also missed and was later shot down, and the other 2 of the group were also brought down with none of their torpedoes hitting their mark. However, their sacrifice was not in vain, for it had lined up the Yorktown for the 2nd Division's attack. These 5 swooped in and scored 2 devastating hits on Yorktown's port side. In summary, Tomonaga's attack had cost the Japanese 5 torpedo bombers and 2 Zeros.
And so they have those losses, and they have the losses on the first run, going after the same carrier. Because that's the big deal here, right? It's not whether or not you can get the Yorktown specifically. The Yorktown really doesn't have much to do with it. It's that you just want to even this fight out some, but you're losing, from the Japanese perspective, you're losing all of these planes. You only have the planes for this carrier left. And then instead of making a run at and losing these planes to knocking out a second carrier, you go after the same carrier because it looks like it's uninjured, right? And so, man, it's just a brutal loss there, and kind of a really rough turn of events, that it seems as if the Yorktown was not one of the carriers that got hit initially.
The Americans had lost 4 fighters. A photograph captured the moment the torpedo struck. It was this attack that had dealt tremendous and decisive damage to the Yorktown. She lost all power, 3 of her boilers were knocked out, her rudder was jammed, and with water gushing in, a severe list developed. It seemed apparent that the carrier would capsize at any moment, which would have caused a heavy loss of life. So the captain ordered abandoned ship at 1500. The Yorktown was now definitely out of the fight. By 1545, Hiryu's surviving planes had landed. At this point, the Hiryu was exhausted. Mind you, they had been in constant action for the last 10 hours. Just 10 minutes after they landed, Nagumo received a report from his scout planes. It revealed the truth of Tomonaga's attack. The strike had hit the same carrier as before. So it was still 1 versus 2. With the odds still stacked against them, the Japanese finally decided it was time to retreat and open the range with the Americans.
Okay, so obviously they have a big mix-up there. They've lost a ton of their planes. There's still 2 fully functional carriers left. They're in a really bad spot. I think this is the most prudent move here.
Yamaguchi looked at what remained of his strength, and it was pitiful. Only 4 bows and 5 cates remained. Incredibly, the admiral was still determined to attack the Americans. He would send a dusk attack with these 9 planes, and then call it a day. But first, his exhausted men needed a respite from all the action. The men went in to eat and rest before launching their last counterstrike. However, the airmen would never get that chance. At this point, there's a distressing issue that has to be discussed. It's the controversial decision of Nagumo to close the range with the Americans once they had been discovered. After the 1030 disaster, Nagumo had been left with a single carrier, the Hiryu. The importance of this carrier cannot be overstated. Nagumo was in possession of an expensive military hardware that Japan could ill afford to lose. The Japanese had to fight intelligently from this point onwards. Early reports had indicated that the Americans were closing the gap and only 90 miles away. So fair enough, hopes for a surface engagement was justified. Therefore, Nagumo's decision to charge northeast to close the distance was reasonable. But there is something wrong with this picture. It's this, the Hiryu tagging behind Nagumo's surface force. A carrier has no business in a surface engagement. Not only that, but closing the distance keeps you within the enemy's strike range. And this.
Interesting. I guess I really didn't consider it when they talked about the surface engagement earlier. But you certainly would not want to risk your carrier there. And the Japanese planes have the distance, they have the range to get to the U.S. ships. I really didn't even think about it, about them speeding towards the Americans. The way that it kind of fit into my brain as I was watching it was that the Americans were moving in the other direction, and so the Japanese were going to kind of like quote unquote tail them. Um, but now that he's broken it down that way, yeah, that doesn't make a ton of sense. That's actually really interesting. Okay, we're about halfway through, so I think I'm going to cut it here. Um, Hopefully, I can get the second half out tomorrow. Like I said, if not, I'll get it out the day after tomorrow. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below about all this. About some of the decisions that were made. About anything that hasn't been talked about that y'all want to put out there. These conversations are super interesting to me. And so I'm curious what everybody thinks. But with all that said, I'll see you all next time.